Coming out, guys, on this pre-Snowmageddon Friday. Big thanks to Lars and the guys at CreativeMornings and Blue Cadet and the library for hosting us. You good? All right, excellent. All right. So I guess I'll just hop into it. Okay, the book's getting passed around. Cool. All right. I'll give you guys a little bit of background on the book. It was put out in 2014 by Tin House. They had put out similar books like this in the past that draw from, it must be my braces, yeah, anyway. That had drawn from major literary works. And so they had approached me about the possibility of doing one. And to my thinking, Leaves of Grass was the natural choice because to me, up to this point, what they were doing was just basically juxtaposing images with the text as it was set. But what I thought was the next progression of this was to integrate the text with the imagery, and that seemed to be the way to go. As you can see, the 1855 edition was just this torrent of text, and what I wanted to do was like almost bring it back to an even more wild, feral state where the text is almost inchoate and just almost formless. So I picked Song of Myself, and for me that was the obvious choice because it was the perfect length for an illustrated book. The original 1855 edition is about 50 pages long, and with the imagery and everything, it kind of protracts out to about 260 pages in the actual book. The naturalistic tone inside of Song of Myself was also something that I was intrigued by because it presented a real interpretive challenge for me. It didn't lend itself as immediately as, say, Edgar Allan Poe would, or something more lurid or sensational. It was basically about everyday life. And so it also put a challenge to me in that I had to integrate my everyday life. You know, my contribution was to add the images to the text, where both the author and the illustrator were contributing. We were drawing from their everyday lives in order to make the thing live. So it forced me to take digressions that I otherwise might not, and it forced me to sort of wrestle with the poem rather than just merely reflect it. The loose structure of the poem, I don't know how many of you have read Song of Myself? Any? Okay, cool. So you guys know what I'm talking about. When I'm talking about it's sort of a precursor to free verse and that sort of thing. So essentially, it's just this torrent of verse. There are no stanzas or anything like that, like you would find with his contemporary Longfellow. And so you really are getting this sort of stream of consciousness thing. The poem the poem begins with the letter I, and it ends with you. And in between all of that, you get this tour of the democratic self. And not just in a political sense, but in a metaphysical sense. He basically shows you that I am the fireman, I am the prostitute, I am the slave running away. And basically what he's doing is he's basically teaching us how the democratic self is based on empathy and how we see ourselves and not just everybody else, but in everything. By the end of the book, he's dissipated himself and he's basically everything, the ground of being, including us. So that's my nickel and dime take on Whitman in general. But I wanted the book to be more experimental and vital than in the printed versions that you can find. So again, I did take it into another direction. Let's see what For coherence sake, though, Whitman Illuminated is not really organized around the line or the verse cluster, because they're really, you have verse clusters, but the amount of text per spread changes drastically throughout the book, and the reason for that is because each theme or idea or image kind of expends itself, and then you have to start a new page spread. That's the only organizational unit that you really have in this book. It's the only one that really works. Otherwise, the whole thing would be kind of a chaotic mess, because you wouldn't have the images jiving with what is actually in the text. So each spread has sort of a thought in the image, and then it expends itself, and then you flip the page, and then you're on to something else. And every single day, as I worked on this, I mean, the book itself is the notebook. There are no real sketches or anything like that. This book, basically, I would just start fresh with a bracket of text every single day and just work from that. And that's basically how it worked. It resulted in a more impressionistic book than previous editions of Whitman. Much more so than the reader to traverse the poem in digressive ways. This is also in keeping with how Whitman composed his poetry as well. He's writing on ferries, he's writing on omnibuses. If you look at his notebooks, I mean, he's one of the first writers, really, who's writing as he's on the go. He's in the middle of the metropolis, he's taking in everything, he's writing down his impressions, and then he's taking these little jottings, and then he's doing something rather new, and it's something that's sort of the hallmark of much of American literature, is that he kind of introduces the modular line, and that it's almost a kind of collage that he's doing. He's moving things around, he's shifting things around, he's like that, So in other words, it isn't set in stone, it isn't a progressional thing. It's definitely, the primacy is on the overall impression rather than the order of the lines. And with that in mind, you can see I took an awful lot of liberties with the order of the lines. So much so that each time you read this, you potentially could read a different poem because the order is out. The overall gist of the spreads are much more important than the actual order of the lines. And the meaning can change from reading to reading because of that. The emphasis also changes as well. This is also in keeping with Whitman, because Whitman wanted the poem itself to mean something different for every single person that read it. He wanted it to become a new poem every time it met new eyes, which I think is an exciting thought. But again, as far as the pace of the reading goes, you can see the book, if you're holding it in your hands, it's designed to be rotated in your lap. It's meant to, be as dense as possible. It's meant to be as extreme. There was a little bit of back and forth with the publisher over this. They originally were going back and forth whether or not, it's like, well, I don't know, maybe we need it a little bit larger. It's kind of small, but I wanted it very dense so that when you open it up, there's this richness and there's fecundity, and it feels like it's exploding out of your hands when you're opening it. But also, I wanted it to almost overwhelm the eye, so much so that it either kind of either repelled a reader or it drew them in even further. So it's basically the polar opposite of what most of us have come to think of as reading, which is basically scanning. You're looking, the kind of reading that we all do when we're online, where we're scanning through text, or we're just trying to get the gist of something. We're just kind of like, breezing through it, and okay, we got that, boom. I wanted to do something that was much, much different than that. I wanted to do something that flies very much in the face of that kind of reading. I believe that the audience is just as important as the artist as far as cultural output goes. If you don't have an audience that is receptive, it's very hard to achieve certain things. And so this is my way of kind of pushing into this direction where we're trying out a radical slowness as far as reading. I think there's a lot of different ways one can read, just as there are a lot of different ways one can write. but just go back to that. So you're slowly traversing Whitman's poetic landscape as you go through it. My hope is that there's going to be a few troubled souls out there that'll actually take me up on the challenge and maybe read a couple spreads a night and really let it sink in over, just leave it on your nightstand, just, read a couple spreads, over the maybe the next month or two or something, and just let it really absorb. Yeah, more or less, the work is completed in the mind, if not in the page. The goal is to create a parallel visual narrative to Whitman's words and form this interpretive gap. In other words, I'm not trying to basically reflect the text. I'm trying to add something to the text, something, a new dimension, and the reader kind of inhabits that gap between the text and the image. So more or less, the book was pretty well received, but as you can imagine, there were some detractors who felt that the book was unreadable. And again, it kind of comes back to how conventions of reading have changed over the years. It seems that over the past couple of generations, we've grown less comfortable with the idea of just being lost in the text, not knowing quite where the text is going, what the text is driving at. We really have married ourselves, maybe a little overly invested in the idea of clarity for clarity's sake when it comes to texts and language in general. But I think that writing can be a lot more than just a mode of conveyance. And the pleasure of being lost in the text is almost alien to a lot of us now. And I think many readers think that an author has failed them if they haven't comprehended absolutely everything on the page at first glance, and I think that's a shame. I believe that, legibility and retention can increase with difficulty. In fact, there's some confirmation of my hunches on this point. In 2010, psychologists at Princeton University published "Fortune Favors the Bold and the Italicized," a study demonstrating that people have better recall of what they've read when it is printed in smaller, less legible type. Which kind of flies in the face of what a lot of us were taught in graphic design classes. Texts presented in unusual typefaces created disfluency in readers, triggering deeper processing and significantly improved retention, which is the opposite of what you intuitively think. When people are forced to stare at something to decipher what it says, it sticks with them. End quote. And so there you have it. I believe there should be a spirit of exploration in the act of reading, and there should be a variety of ways to read a text, a continuum of modes by which language can connect the mind. And how we say something matters as much as what we're saying. And it would be nice if readers embraced more experimentation in writing and in language in general for this reason. And some experiments, are going to fail, but that contributes to the vitality of any basic practice out there. And this, I don't know if we necessarily need yet another conventional book, another book that's really clear. And we really got, the modernist experiment really got us into the idea of clarity. And maybe it's time to try something else. And I also think that it's exciting for the eye to come across fresh new configurations on a printed page. That may be because I'm a bit of a print dinosaur. I'm probably the only person in this room to cut their teeth on doing paste-up mechanicals and then transitioning over into digital. But if readers can handle the twists and turns of the internet, and I think they can handle more adventurous print books. So I'm militating for that. And so, basically sometimes you need to sing an old song in a new way. And that's really all I have to say on that. If you guys want to throw any questions or comments or snide remarks? Okay. kind of burned through the entire thing because I was worried that you guys wouldn't have time to yell at me.
Do you think that I'm really interested in the idea of like disfluency and generating deeper understanding, and like in my field of architecture, there's like similar thinking that like smoothness is too easy in some ways, but I wonder, could you have a pairing of a familiar poem with an unfamiliar like format and your own idiosyncratic style of illustration? So
yeah, I would have been able to do it if the poem wasn't so familiar.
Exactly. That's if there are any others, like if it wasn't Walt Whitman, who would it be, or like are there any?
Oh man, I would love to try William Carlos Williams or John Berryman. I'm a big Berryman fan. You know, I just think he's probably one of the more devastating yet hilarious poets that we had. But I think he's been neglected largely. But yeah, I mean, I picked Song of Myself because it is so familiar, because there are so many editions out there, and because of that, you could afford to take liberties like that. If it was the work of an obscure poet that no one had ever read or never even heard of, or knew the gist of, it would be. I don't think it would have been successful at all. I don't think. Number one, I don't think any publisher would have signed off on it. I mean, I actually tried to get like an E.E. Cummings or William Carlos Williams, and no one would bite on it. And I said, wait, he's a funny guy.
I'm curious, what is the most recent book you've read? What's the most recent book you've read, and if you liked it?
I can make some recommendations on the kind of language I'm talking about. That would probably be more useful to you rather than, I actually work one day a week at Brickbat Books, so I get to do an awful lot of reading. So right now I'm actually kind of plowing through Brian Leibowitz's stuff right now, which is near and dear to my heart because I kind of cut my teeth as a professional smartass back in the early aughts with my own writing. My first book was optioned by Johnny Depp's production company in Lee Hill, and there was a little bit of going back and forth, but thankfully I didn't get sucked into that machine. I got all the money but none of the blame. So but I can show you guys that. I have a copy of that book with me if you guys want to see that afterwards, which is it's like a world away from what I'm doing with the Whitman thing, which is good. I tend to kind of like pick my poems, but I would look up The Age of Wire and String by Ben Marcus. Anybody read that? Anybody? That's a great book. I mean, if you're interested in language and how language can really be eerie and foreign and just completely dissociated from its original intent, but also still eminently readable and even entertaining and even hilarious, actually, in some parts. It's a really weird little book. And I think it's Ben Marcus. It's my favorite of his, actually, because it's a short book, but it's deeply, deeply strange. Yeah, that would be my pick. Yeah, get that. The Age of Wire and Spring. Yeah, The Age of Wire and Spring by Ben Marcus. It came out in the early 90s, and I think it's been utterly neglected. And I think it's a really inventive. I think Robert Coover was a real big fan of that book when it came out. It's like, this is the most audacious debut in American letters in a generation, and no one seems to have read it. So I would definitely recommend The Age of Wire and String. Any other? Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about Word Within City?
Yeah, if you want. That kind of gets back to my professional smartass years. I have a copy of it here. Tongue-in-cheek fancy man. Here you guys. Here. But what that was, I brought that along because that's another mode. It's performative literature is what it was. I thought, well, how interesting would it be? It's like you think in terms of pop-up books, and basically I'm the thing that's popping up out of the book. It's like how, it's like, that movie, The Purple Rose of Cairo, where there's like an actual character steps out, the character steps out of the movie. I thought, well, wouldn't that be great if we actually had a genre of books, a genre of writing, where it's just, there's a performative aspect to it, where the writer actually assumes a character, and then the character kind of steps out into the actual world, and people actually see him walking down the street or something. And it's kind of like a performance art thing, but kept me out of trouble. Well, actually, not in this. Yeah, I almost got beat up a couple of times. You walk around in velvet in Philly. So that was a bit of a stunt. But then, but the problem is, what happened is like it was a lark, you know, it was a kind of a tongue-in-cheek sort of thing, and then it kind of started growing legs on me, and you know, and it was all because of language. It was like this really, you know, it's like it was this sort of exercise I wanted to do where I wanted to kind of play with high Victorian purple prose, kind of melded with Benjamin Franklin's Poor Bridget's Almanac with all the systematics and the diagrams that kind of went with it, and kind of pair the essay with the systematics and kind of put those together and kind of make that into sort of a trope that kind of leapfrogged through the book. But you know, it turned out it became a job. You know, I became like a witch doctor with a tie or something. People, you know, I was being flown out to do weddings. People were asking me advice, life advice. It's like, he was like, you got the wrong guy. It's like, you know, I'm running around dressed in velvet. You want advice from me? I'm middle-aged and unemployable for this. I haven't had a job in like 20 years. I want to keep it that way. It's everything I ever wanted to be. But yeah, it became a job, and then it kind of, you know, so you started out with a mask, and what happens is it migrates north and becomes a hat, you know, and all of a sudden, that's what happened to me. It's like the mask eats the face, and then all of a sudden, you got to be very careful what you know, Vonnegut was right. You have to be very careful who you pretend to be, because people will take you at your word. You know? You're like, oh, well, you know, I ride around on a high wheel, and I like knickers. I was like, oh, well, really, yeah, it's like, guys, I was just kidding, and the next thing I know, it took me at face value. But if I was really being honest with you, I was kind of hiding in plain sight, too. You know, it's like, it was like the desert island version of myself. It was like, if there was no society, this is what I'd be doing. So it was, you know, basically I was like a lab rat, you know, conducting experiments on myself. So it was a ridiculous experiment, but at the same time, I was the only one that had to take it completely seriously, you know, because they had to be really well crafted in order for it to work, and in order for it to kind of go off. Full depth, I got money out of his ass. Anybody else got it? I got lots of answers. Yes.
So, how much would you say when you worked on like each piece, like that you? How much attention did you pay to like the user experience as far as like just like the pages go for, you know what I mean? Like how much did you focus on the book as a whole versus like just the individual experience per page?
Oh man, constantly. I mean, I was flipping through, you know, it's very important that there's a sort of oscillation not only of the amount of text, but the format. That was one of the reasons why, if you look through the thing, there's a galloping color palette. You know, it's like red, green, blue, red, green, blue, red, green, blue. And that's another way, you know, not only just bracketing it thematically, but also graphically. Because the book itself, if you notice, thematically, if you look at the visual vocabulary in the book, it starts out kind of rather wide. And I'm still kind of tinkering with the thing as I'm going. So it is a work in progress, but as you get towards the end of the book, it gets much more specific, and then I'm kind of ironing out the theme. And by the end of the book, the theme's pretty well established visually. And it's interesting that thematically it's getting more and more narrow as the self, the democratic self in the poem gets wider and wider and wider. So like Whitman and I are kind of crossing each other in the foyer, as it were. But to answer your question, I mean, I was quite literally making the book up as I went along. So the book is actually a record of the process. And my way of, I look at it as a design project more than an illustration project. It just happened to have that aspect to it because that's how it lends. I'm looking at 19th century scrimshaw and things like that. So it's like I wanted a crude, very simple way of working the images and through the thing. And apparently it was pretty effective. I just got word that I won a gold medal at the Society of Illustrators this year. And best of show 3x3. And a bunch of other baubles baubles and trinkets, that profession for those actually good boy. So now I got, my choice of carpet ornaments to try out. Yes.
You'd see on some pages it's full of text, and other pages
Yeah.
it's very loose, like a few lines. How would you?
Inhale, exhale.
Yeah. How would you group?
Well, like I said, what I would do is I would, it was based completely on what the theme was going on in the text. If, like, say, the Alamo piece, where it's just like one big thing where he's talking about the Alamo, that all had to be on one spread, and you are cramming things in. It was, typographically, it was a nightmare to work these things in, but you also had to make it visually interesting. So you had clusters and all that, so you had to really jumble things in. So you're basically making up the jigsaw puzzle as you're trying to put it together, basically. So yeah, it really depended on what Walt was giving you at any given moment. It's like, well, if he's just visiting this and then turning his gaze again, then you got a nice wide open space for that spread. And it just so happens that as you go through the poem, he does that. There are short little bits, and there are things where he really ruminates on them and catalogs an awful lot. And so you see visually throughout the book, the visual density changes. And that's good, because you need to relieve the eye quite a bit. But it is something I was considering. It's like, if I'm getting tired of it, the reader's definitely going to get tired of it. And that's basically what it came down to. Is that if I'm tired of looking at something, and this is exhausting me, kind of flipping through this, I got to break this up. Because otherwise I'm just going to exhaust the reader, and I don't want to do that. I'm already asking an awful lot of any reader who's picking up the book, because really, you're basically absorbing this book. You're not really reading it. You're reading it, but you have to really kind of tease the thing apart. I basically put an awful lot into this thing. You're teasing out all these different individual threads. I'm basically giving you work. You're working for me when you pick up this book. I'm a jerk. Yes.
You touched on this a little bit, but I'm interested in how your relationship to the language changed or evolved. Like, you said that the reader has an experience when they go back and read it, but what about you? Did you start something and then go back and say, oh, now this other thing is arising to me and maybe I'll reinterpret it this way, or any kind of...
I kind of have an ambivalence towards Whitman generally. I think what I came away from the project overall is I felt like I was more interested in his ideas. That he was what he said is, I was simmering, and he started reading Emerson, and he said Emerson brought me to a boil. And his relationship with Emerson is a whole other thing I'll tell you about later. But his relationship with a lot of people I'll tell you about later. But basically, I'm more interested in the ideas that are being put across in the poem rather than his poetics. I find that, I don't know how to put this, I find generally the format for me doesn't, I like concision. That's, I think I'm kind of a fuddy-duddy modernist, and I like, this is why I love Williams, and I like things that have I'm nuts over Nick Virgilio. Any of you guys ever hear Nick Virgilio, the haiku poet from Camden? Yeah, he died back in '86, but he was like the master. He took the haiku form and reinvented it into an urban American idiom. Right now, I know Rutgers University is putting together a huge archive of his work. Definitely check him out. But getting back to Whitman, I tend to prefer concision and essay. So his poetics has a limited appeal to me. I don't really necessarily see Song of Myself as really a poem in the proper sense, really. It's more like a manifesto, a metaphysical manifesto of Whitman's. It's like this mystic text that he's putting in a quasi-poetic form, but that people of that time, he met with an awful lot of hostility because they did not recognize it as poetry, because it wasn't in a set form. He was the one that kind of broke up the wood, and then other people came in, and someone like William Carlos Williams or Wallace Stevens came along and kind of gave it a little bit more specific form. But what I really love about Whitman is that he had the audacity. Here's an amateur, basically. He's relatively self-educated by our standards. and he's wrestling with this thing. He's the first generation of Americans that said, well, what does it mean to be an American writer? You know, rather than a second-rate European writer. You know, it's like, what does the American idiom look like? And he was the one that answered that question. So, I don't know if that answers your question. Anybody else? Yes. Yeah, sure.
This is actually something very personally interested in. So, you know, I working in a field of technology, you know, and like there's these practices like UI, UX, which is basically grading things.
Right.
You know, and like the whole, like this whole sort of like the aesthetics of like simplicity and things that are sort of born out of like, you know, startups where everything needs to be incredibly simple and information needs to be disseminated very clearly. I love the idea of creating stuff that's messy. And you mentioned something in there about that.
Yeah, creating problems for people, impediments really, but what you find is, and apparently this study kind of bears it out, this 2010 study at Princeton University, is that if you actually throw things in people's way, they tend to retain them more, which is, you know, it sounds counterintuitive because we're always like clarity, clarity, clarity. You know, that's something that we're always, you know, as design professionals are trained to embrace and, you know, take as gospel. But here you have a psychologist saying that actually a little bit of roughage in there is maybe a good thing. Maybe it doesn't have to be that clean. A clean, brightly lit room may not necessarily get all of our attention, and it, you know, it doesn't really ignite our animal senses. You know, whereas if you're in a forest, you're kind of looking around, you know, seeing if there's animal life going on. So there's a lot of multivalence going on in the sensory sense. And maybe what you got to do in order to keep people interested in for lack of a better term, receptive, is to kind of replicate that forest in book form, and not just chop down a tree and make paper pulp out of it, but you know, that level of detail, and you know, give them nooks to kind of explore. You know, let them inhabit the book. You know, make it a conversation rather than something that, you know, somebody's holding forth from on high and kind of just imparting to them. You know, it's a collaborative effort, in other words. You know, and that's language in a nutshell. So,
how many did you have to redo plates a lot? Did you find that you'd have to redraft them if they weren't working?
Only one or two, because I was, number one, I was under the gun. I really had to pump this thing out because, I mean, I basically took an entire year out. And you can imagine what I was doing with my finances. Well, imagine what this profession is doing with my finances. But it's very slimming. But yeah, there's maybe only about 2 or 3 spreads that I actually went back on. I felt very strongly, unless it was a real dog, and I did some real turkeys in this thing. But unless it was a real dog, I just left it as a record of the process. Which I don't know if that necessarily runs counter to the design ethic. It's more like an fine art ethic, but I felt like that was important in this particular project, that should be, you know, because I was going from the 1855 edition of Leaves of Grass, and that's the really rough one. That's, if any of you haven't read Leaves of Grass, get the 1855. That's a fun one. It's lean, it's wild, it's raucous, and it's just full of brambles. I really love the 1855. Yes.
Going off that question, did you come in with the imagery for the different spreads? Did you do a lot of thinking beforehand, or did you just pick like what first came to mind?
Oh man, well, you know what? Every 2-page spread probably took me about 10-12 hours. That's a full day. But first 5 hours of the day, I was just banging my head against the wall, just reading the passage, and But I didn't really do a lot of sketching at all. You know, maybe a little thumbnail of something kind of. But I just went, right to paper. Slap some tracing paper. Just slapped it up there, and then just started inking it out, and then doing the final inking, scanning it in, cleaning it up. I'm a stranger to Wacom tablets. My buddy dude, he's trying to get me to go down that route, but I'm not quite ready yet. I like the irregularities that you get with actual pen and ink. That's hard to replicate. But no, the whole book is basically one big notebook. You know, it's the whole thing, it records the process. So, yeah. Any other questions? Oh, well, thank you very much.